Parliament's Ethics Committee has cleared former Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize of any wrongdoing in the Digital Vibe saga. Mkhize stepped down, you'll remember, from his position last year after he was embroiled in a graft scandal. The committee says he did not breach the ethics code by not disclosing what he received from that company. For more on this now, let's bring in the co-chair of the committee, that's Bekizwe Nkosi. Also joining us is the DA's Siviwe Gwarube, who actually laid that complaint to begin with. To both our guests, thanks for your time. It's lovely to have you on the program. Babu Nkosi, let me begin with you. I mean, the committee was essentially probing this complaint on two fronts. One, whether or not there was any kind of benefit towards Zweli Mkhize's son, and the second part was around benefits directly to Zweli Mkhize in the form of electrical work that was done to his property in Bryanston. Help us understand then on what basis he's been cleared.
Thank you very much, Ayanda, and thank you for having me, and welcome to your viewers. The first thing is that on the first issue, on the benefit to Zweli Mkhize's son, when we examined the evidence or the facts before us, both from the complainant and the response from Dr. Zweli Mkhize and all additional affidavits, we found that, as he indicates in his report, in his affidavit, that his son is not his dependent. In terms of our code of ethics, which defines an immediate family as a member, spouse, permanent companion, or dependent, all these criteria doesn't apply to Zweli Mkhize's son. We must emphasize that we then found that he is not in breach in respect of the fact that there is his dependent who has benefited. However, the committee also noted in that same vein that all other processes of investigation and possible prosecutorial processes are not in our remit, and therefore these will continue independent of what the committee has found. So we close the matter on the basis that there is no dependent relationship between Dr. Zweli Mkhize and his son. The investigations as to whether there is criminality is a matter of the SIU and the NGPP.
All right, and on the second front, where we're told that according to...
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. On the second issue, we examined the complaint as brought to us and have, in that process, solicited all affidavits from both Dr. Zweli Mkhize and all that were involved in the transmission of the money from Thamsanqa Mkhize right up to DigiVibes. What we found is that on the basis of the emails and the invoices that were presented to us, it is possible that the version given by Thamsanqa Mkhize is correct, that he only was the liaison between the service provider, DigiVibes, and therefore he handled that matter. And in that regard, it was not possible then to arrive at a connection between a benefit to Dr. Mkhize and DigiVibes. On that basis, we then said that the evidence points otherwise, and therefore there is no transgression of the code of ethics as required by the code itself.
In other words,
again we emphasize the fact that any prosecutorial processes are not in our remit and are the responsibility of the SIU and the prosecutor authority. However, on the basis of the evidence that or the information placed before us, we couldn't find any discretion.
Okay, my understanding is that the second part of the complaint, and Siviwe, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, actually was linked to whether or not Zweli Mkhize benefited because of electrical work that was done at a property that he owns in Bryanston. Does the committee at least appreciate that work was done at that property through the help of Digital Vibes?
However, yes, we will acknowledge that.
Right.
However, what the complaint is about payments, about the on the maintenance or the alleged benefit thereof. Those payments, we have ascertained, have not come from Dr. Mkhize. It is only our remit to use our code to determine that. The SIU and the NGPP have a responsibility to go further than we do and we will not impede them in that process.
Okay, so it comes from digital vibes, but doesn't come directly from the minister. Okay, I guess that's a technicality that will have to be ascertained in investigations. But Siviwe Gwarube, you're the one, as part of the DA, who actually lodged this complaint. This is the explanation, the logic, if you like, that underpins the minister being absolved. Are you happy with it?
Good morning, Ayanda, and good morning to my colleague and your viewers. Look, we've expressed disappointment. I do think it's important, firstly, to note that the deliberations of the Ethics Committee are confidential. And while I'm a complainant, I'm not a member of the committee. And so what I have is the explanation which the co-chairperson has given. And so really, in my view, we've expressed disappointment really in the findings of the committee, not having heard what their deliberations were. Because and here's the reason why. On the first issue, particularly as it pertains to the minister's son, as the co-chairperson says, one of the reasons why his son is precluded from being seen as a beneficiary is because of the fact that he's not a dependent. And our view here is that this is a very narrow application of the code, or what the ethics code seeks to do. And if you read the code in itself, you realize that actually there's the entire spirit of the ethics code which seeks to make sure that public representatives carry themselves out with integrity. I can appreciate the technical application, but our view is that this was extremely narrow, to the point where a person who's related to the minister is allegedly said to have benefited from a contract that they would likely not have benefited from had their father not been the health minister, if indeed this has happened. I can appreciate the difficulty of the parliamentary committee and the limitation of the work, but I do think that there was much more scope to look at the spirit of what the ethics code sought to do, and the drafters of the code, and look at it in a far more holistic manner.
Right.
Even with the issue around the upgrades to the home, while yes, the invoices do not see the former minister personally liaising with the company, the reality is that the property belongs to the former minister. And so really there has to be some level of accountability and culpability in accordance to the code. So we are disappointed, but we are going to be making sure and looking at the other processes that are unfolding.
Yeah, especially, Siviwe, when you consider that it's known that typically anybody who'll be involved in some kind of complex skullduggery will use companies as proxies for themselves, and you'll have payments, of course, going from companies to, for instance, their own homes or own properties, without necessarily having their names attached to it. That's predictable. Anybody who doesn't do things that way, I guess, would not necessarily be experienced in trying to cover up their tracks, so to speak.
And in my view, and I think perhaps this is a good case study to the co-chairperson and maybe the committee itself, that maybe that provision of the code needs to be particularly looked at. Well, either maybe it is narrowly drafted, or in this application it was narrowly applied, because it seeks to say that you're not allowed to, your spouse and your dependents or your immediate family are not allowed to be beneficiaries improperly so. And so our view is that whether or not the son of Dr. Mkhize is a dependent on him, the reality is that if it indeed has happened, it would be undue benefit. And so I think that there's work to be done here, because we've got to make sure that the code and the ethics code really is applied far more generously, so that we can make sure that it does what it's sought to do. And so, of course, we know that the SIU process is ongoing, and the Hawks investigation is ongoing. And so we will be keeping an eye on that, because, of course, Dr. Mkhize does remain a member of parliament.
Right. Babu Bekizwe, let me bring you back into the discussion. Siviwe feels at the very least you missed the spirit here of the ethics code in your application. What's your response to that?
Ayanda, let me appreciate what Honorable Gwarube says. We don't deal with hypothecation. We apply the ethics code as it is written. There is no narrow or wider application. It is the strictest interpretation of what appears in the code that we apply. Secondly, our committee is a multi-party committee. We don't reach decisions by vote. We reach decisions by consensus after intensive deliberation on the issues that are before us, not any other issues that is speculative otherwise.
Were there any members of your committee who disagreed?
Thirdly, if there is any indication that the code needs to be amended and reworked, this the committee has acknowledged, and in the National Assembly has done the same. That is why we have a committee, a subcommittee that is looking at, re-looking at the code and revamping it or amending it to cater for predictability. Otherwise, on the current code and its provisions, we have found that there is no indiscretion. And for us, that closes the matter. And in conclusion, the SIU, the Hawks, and the National Department of, Directorate of Public Prosecution is looking at the matter, and that is not our remit.
Right.
It is the remit.
Given what is being highlighted,
we will give them the space to do that, because we do not act with, we act without favor, fear, and prejudice.
Right. Given what's been highlighted in the form of the concerns that have been raised by Siviwe, and I imagine shared by many people following the story, do you reckon that there are perhaps limitations in the ways through which the committee is looking at this ethics code? Because I think part of what you said in your response is that you look at the code and take it for what it is. But surely there are shortcomings that can come from that, especially in a context where Parliament is already facing pressure for its lack of oversight in the past.
I think the first thing that we must note is that Parliament has taken a very decisive decision to work towards ensuring that there is no corruption in the state and in society. Secondly, that the code as it is has got its own difficulties. That is why we are working towards amending the code and making it relevant to current situations. It was a code drafted many years ago, amended several times, but the limitations are being addressed on a continuous basis.
Where do those limitations lie?
The limitations lie in being specific on several issues, which I cannot go through because they span the entire code. And therefore, the subcommittee has a responsibility to look at the entire code from its beginning on the definitions, on what constitutes a transgression, or what constitutes a flagrant disregard of the law, on what constitutes members' interests, etc. Those issues will be subjected to review.
And do you think it's those limitations that allowed the former minister to be absolved in the way that he has?
I don't think so. I think on the strictest application of the current code as it stands, there is no indiscretion.
All right. Bekizwe Nkosi is the co-chairperson of the Ethics Committee in Parliament. Siviwe Gwarube is an MP with the Democratic Alliance. She, of course, laid that complaint to begin with. Plenty else to be said, but that's where we're going to have to fold it, given the time at our disposal.